Every child deserves to feel wanted, to stand beside someone who claims them as their own. In the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, 1847, a small black girl carried that desperate hope in her heart as she approached the most unlikely person in town. The wealthy cowboy, Samuel Harrison, was known throughout the territory for his pride, his solitude, and his cold indifference to the struggles of others around him. But when 10-year-old Ruby asked him to pretend to be her father for just 10 minutes at the church gathering where orphans were being placed with families, something unexpected stirred deep within his hardened heart. What secret from Samuel's troubled past would this simple act of kindness reveal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Cedar Ridge's main street, where dust motes danced in golden shafts of light, filtering through the gaps between buildings. This frontier town, nestled in a valley between rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and mesquite, had grown from a simple trading post into a thriving community of nearly 300 souls. The railroad had brought prosperity, and with it, people seeking fresh starts and second chances in the American West. Samuel Harrison sat on the covered porch of Murphy's General Store, his polished leather boots propped against the wooden railing. At 35, he possessed the weathered handsomeness of a man who'd spent years under the unforgiving frontier sun, yet his clothing spoke of wealth rarely seen in these parts. His black Stetson was brushed clean, his vest tailored from fine wool, and his pants pressed with military precision. Most telling was the silver pocket watch that caught the morning light as he checked the time, an inheritance from a father whose memory brought more pain than comfort. The watch had belonged to his father, Thomas Harrison, a man whose rigid expectations and harsh judgment had driven Samuel from their Virginia plantation 15 years ago. Thomas had built an empire on cotton and human suffering, viewing the enslaved people on his land as nothing more than property to be bought, sold and worked until they dropped. Samuel had watched his father's cruelty with growing revulsion, especially after befriending a young slave girl named Mary, whose gentle spirit and quick mind had shown him that his father's beliefs were built on lies. When Samuel finally confronted Thomas about the inhumanity of slavery, the old man had flown into a rage that shattered their relationship forever. "You're weak," Thomas had spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Soft-hearted and foolish, just like your mother. If you can't stomach what it takes to build something lasting, then you're no son of mine." Those words had burned themselves into Samuel's memory, and he'd left that very night with nothing but the clothes on his back and his mother's Bible. Now, years later, Samuel had built his own empire in Texas. 10,000 acres of prime cattle land, 200 head of longhorn cattle, and a ranch house that rivaled anything back east. He'd proven his father wrong about weakness, but the old man's harsh words about soft-heartedness had taken root. Samuel had learned to keep people at arm's length, to build walls around his heart as sturdy as the stone foundation of his ranch house. It was safer that way, lonelier perhaps, but safer. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge respected Samuel Harrison, but few could claim to know him. He conducted his business with fairness and integrity, paid his debts promptly, and treated his ranch hands with dignity, yet he kept to himself, attending church only when social obligations demanded it, and declining invitations to barn dances and community gatherings. Some whispered that his wealth had made him prideful, others that he simply preferred his own company to that of common folk. The truth was more complicated. Samuel had learned early that caring too deeply led to heartbreak. Mary, the young slave who'd become like a sister to him, had died of fever the winter before he left Virginia. He'd held her hand as she passed, promising her that someday he'd find a way to make a difference, to help others like her find freedom and dignity. But 15 years had passed, and Samuel had built walls instead of bridges, accumulated wealth instead of relationships. This Sunday morning found him in town for supplies, though his real purpose was to avoid the church gathering that would take place that afternoon. Word had spread throughout the territory that families were welcome to come and potentially adopt one of the 12 orphaned children currently residing at the Cedar Ridge orphanage. The thought of watching children parade themselves before prospective parents, hoping to be chosen like livestock at auction, stirred uncomfortable memories Samuel preferred to keep buried. The orphanage itself was a testament to the community's compassion. A 2-story wooden structure painted white with green shutters, surrounded by a carefully tended garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the orphanage director, was a widow in her 50s whose own children had grown and moved away. She'd taken on the responsibility of caring for unwanted children with the same dedication she'd once given to raising her own family. Among the 12 children under Mrs. Whitman's care, none had captured the town's attention quite like Ruby. At 10 years old, she possessed an unusual combination of resilience and vulnerability that set her apart from the other orphans. Her dark skin marked her as different in a town where the population was predominantly white, but it was her spirit that truly distinguished her, an unshakable optimism in the face of repeated disappointments. Ruby's story, like many frontier and tales, was marked by tragedy and survival. Her parents had been freed slaves who'd made their way to Texas with dreams of building a new life. Her father, Benjamin, had been a skilled blacksmith, while her mother, Sarah, took in washing and mending to help support the family. They'd managed to purchase a small plot of land outside Cedar Ridge and were making progress toward establishing a homestead when cholera swept through the area 3 years ago. Ruby had been visiting Mrs. Whitman, who was teaching her to read, when the fever took both her parents within a week of each other. At 7 years old, she'd found herself utterly alone in the world, with no relatives to claim her and no inheritance except her mother's silver ring, a simple band that Ruby kept carefully hidden, her only tangible connection to the family. She'd lost. In the 3 years since, Ruby had watched countless families visit the orphanage, their eyes scanning the children like shoppers examining merchandise. Younger children were typically preferred, as were those whose appearances suggested they might blend seamlessly into established families. Ruby's skin color, while not an absolute barrier in this part of Texas, where prejudice was less entrenched than in other regions, still made potential parents hesitant. But Ruby possessed something that couldn't be diminished by others' prejudices. An unwavering belief in the power of family, in the possibility that somewhere there was someone who would see her worth and claim her as their own. She taught herself to read by studying Mrs. Whitman's Bible, and in its pages she'd found stories of unlikely families, of people bound together not by blood, but by choice and love. Mrs. Whitman had grown particularly fond of Ruby, recognizing in the girl a strength of character that would serve her well regardless of her circumstances. She'd made sure Ruby received the same education as the white children in town, arranging for her to attend the schoolhouse where she'd proven to be one of the brightest students. Yet despite Ruby's intelligence and sweet nature, she remained unadopted while younger children found homes. The upcoming church gathering represented another opportunity, but Mrs. Whitman privately worried it might be Ruby's last real chance. At 10, Ruby was approaching the age where adoption became increasingly unlikely. Soon she'd be expected to earn her keep as a domestic servant or field hand, her dreams of family replaced by the harsh realities of survival. Samuel pulled his watch from his vest pocket, noting it was nearly 10 o'clock. The church service would begin at 11, followed by the adoption gathering at 2. He'd planned to be well on his way back to the ranch by then, safely removed from the emotional spectacle that was sure to unfold. Children crying when they weren't chosen, families struggling to decide between siblings, the weight of life-altering decisions made in the space of an afternoon. It was too much like the slave auctions he'd witnessed as a child. Too close to the memories he'd spent years trying to forget. The irony wasn't lost on him. that his father's legacy lived on in the very watch he carried. A constant reminder of time passing, of opportunities missed, of the walls he'd built to protect himself from the pain of caring too much. Thomas Harrison had believed that strength came from emotional distance, that sentiment was weakness, that some people were worth more than others based on the accident of their birth. Samuel had built his life in opposition to those beliefs, treating all people with dignity and respect, yet he wondered sometimes if he'd simply traded his father's cruelty for his own form of emotional cowardice. It was easier to be fair and just from a distance than to risk the vulnerability that came with genuine connection. As he sat on the porch that morning, watching the town wake up around him, Samuel had no idea that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be challenged by a 10-year-old girl with worn shoes and an unshakable faith in the possibility of family. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, counting down the moments until an encounter that would change everything he thought he knew about strength, family, and the courage required to open one's heart. The morning sun climbed higher, and Cedar Ridge stirred to life around him, unaware that before the day was through, the most unlikely partnership would form, one that would force both a hardened rancher and a hopeful child to confront their deepest fears about love, belonging, and what it truly means to choose family over blood. The first toll of the church bell echoed across Cedar Ridge at 11:30, its bronze voice calling the faithful to Sunday service. Samuel felt the vibration in his chest as the sound rolled over the town, a reminder of community and belonging that he'd spent years avoiding. He'd finished his business at the general store and was preparing to mount his horse when a voice interrupted his departure. "Mr. Harrison." He turned to find a young black girl standing beside his horse, her worn leather shoes dusty from walking the unpaved streets. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with intelligent brown eyes and hair carefully braided into 2 neat plaits. Her dress was clean but patched in several places, speaking of care taken with meager resources. What struck Samuel most was the determined set of her shoulders. She was nervous, clearly, but not defeated. "Yes?" Samuel's voice was measured. "Polite but distant. My name is Ruby, sir, Ruby Washington." She clasped her small hands in front of her, knuckles white with tension. "I live at the orphanage with Mrs. Whitman." Samuel nodded, already sensing where this conversation might lead. He'd heard about the adoption gathering, and something in the girl's earnest expression suggested she was about to make a request he wasn't prepared to handle. "I see. What can I do for you, Miss Ruby?" The church bell tolled again, and Ruby's eyes darted toward the white steeple visible above the surrounding buildings. When she looked back at Samuel, her expression had intensified, as if she were gathering every ounce of courage she possessed. "Sir, I know you don't know me, and I know I ain't got any right to ask you for anything." Her words came faster now, as if she feared losing her nerve. "But this afternoon families are coming to meet us children, and I've been thinking and praying about it all week." Samuel shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on his horse's reins. He could see where this was heading, and every instinct told him to politely excuse himself and ride away. Getting involved in the personal struggles of others led to complications, to emotional entanglements he'd spent years avoiding. "Miss Ruby," he began, his tone gentle but firm, "I understand your situation is difficult, but I'm not looking to adopt." "No, sir, that ain't what I'm asking." Ruby stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I'm asking if you could pretend to be my papa for just 10 minutes. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Of all the requests he might have anticipated, this wasn't one of them. He stared at the girl, trying to process what she'd just asked. "I beg your pardon." Ruby's composure cracked slightly, and he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I know it sounds foolish, sir, and I know I ain't got no business asking such a thing of a gentleman like yourself, but I've been to 3 of these gatherings before, and every time I stand there by myself while all the other children got there, Names called, and families take them aside to talk. The church bell continued its steady rhythm, marking time as Ruby's desperation became more apparent with each word. I just thought maybe, if I had somebody standing with me, just for a few minutes, maybe one of them families might see that I could belong somewhere too. Her voice broke on the last words, and she quickly wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I ain't asking you to take me home or nothing like that. Just stand there and pretend you're my papa long enough for somebody to see that I'm worth choosing. Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the careful walls he'd built around his heart. The girl's request was so simple, so heartbreaking in its modesty, that it stripped away every defense he'd constructed. She wasn't asking for a home or a family. She was asking for 10 minutes of dignity. 10 minutes of belonging to someone, anyone, so she might have a chance at finding her real place in the world. "Miss Ruby," he said, his voice rougher than before, "you shouldn't need anyone to stand with you to prove your worth. Any family would be fortunate to have you." Ruby shook her head, her braids swaying with the movement. "That might be true, sir, but it ain't how things work. I've been watching long enough to know. The children who get chosen, they either got somebody advocating for them, or they're young enough that families think they can mold them easy. I ain't young enough anymore, and I ain't got nobody." The truth of her words settled heavily between them. Samuel knew enough about the world to understand that she was right. Adoption was often about perception, about families choosing children who seemed likely to integrate smoothly into their existing lives. A 10-year-old black girl, no matter how intelligent or sweet-natured, faced obstacles that younger or different children might not encounter. "Why me?" Samuel asked quietly. "There are other folks in town who might be more suitable for such a request." Ruby bit her lower lip, clearly wrestling with whether to share her reasoning. "Because you're respected, sir. When you speak, people listen. And because—" She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Because Mrs. Whitman says you're a good man who treats folks fair regardless of their station. She says you pay your colored hands the same as your white ones, and that you don't look down on nobody." Samuel felt a flush of embarrassment at the unexpected praise. He'd simply tried to live by principles that seemed basic to him, treating people with dignity, and paying fair wages for honest work. The fact that such behavior was notable enough to be remarked upon spoke to the low standards society often accepted. The church bell tolled one final time, signaling the end of its call to worship. In a few hours, families would gather at the orphanage, and Ruby would once again stand among the other children, hoping to be chosen. Samuel imagined her there, alone and trying to appear worthy, while families gravitated toward younger or different children. 10 minutes, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruby's eyes widened. "Sir, you said 10 minutes. You want me to stand with you and pretend to be your father for 10 minutes? "Yes, sir. That's all I'm asking." Samuel studied her face, seeing hope and fear warring in her expression. Every rational part of his mind told him to decline politely and ride away. He didn't owe this child anything, and getting involved would only complicate his carefully ordered life. But there was something in Ruby's courage, in her willingness to approach a virtual stranger with such a vulnerable request, that called to a part of him he'd tried to silence for years. "If we're going to do this," he said slowly, "we need to do it properly. What's your full name?" "Ruby Washington, sir." "And your parents' names?" "Benjamin and Sarah Washington. They died of cholera 3 years ago." Samuel nodded, filing away the information. "We'll need to know a few things about each other if we're going to convince anyone we're family. What's your favorite color? What do you like to do when you're not at the orphanage?" Ruby's face transformed, hope blooming like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "My favorite color is blue, like the sky in early morning. And I love reading, sir. Mrs. Whitman taught me, and I've read most every book in town." "What's your favorite book?" "The Bible, sir, especially the stories about families who chose each other, like Ruth and Naomi." Samuel felt another crack in his emotional armor. The girl's reference to Ruth, the young woman who'd chosen to stay with her mother-in-law rather than return to her own people, declaring that "your people shall be my people," seemed particularly apt, given their current situation. "All right, Miss Ruby," he said, surprised by his own words, "I'll stand with you this afternoon, but I want you to understand that this is just pretend, just for those 10 minutes. I can't offer you anything beyond that." Ruby nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir. I ain't expecting nothing more. Just 10 minutes of having somebody claim me as their own." As Samuel looked into her earnest young face, he wondered what he was getting himself into. The practical part of his mind insisted this was a mistake, that pretending to be this child's father, even briefly, would create complications he wasn't prepared to handle. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for too long, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what he was supposed to do. The church bell had fallen silent, but its call seemed to echo still in the space between them, a summons not just to worship, but to community, to the kind of belonging that both Samuel and Ruby had been missing in their own ways. The afternoon sun was already climbing toward its zenith when Samuel found himself standing outside the Cedar Ridge orphanage, questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. The white wooden building looked peaceful in the bright light, its green shutters freshly painted and the garden showing signs of careful tending. Yet Samuel felt as nervous as a schoolboy, unsure of what he'd committed himself to. Ruby emerged from the front door precisely at 2 o'clock, and Samuel was struck by how different she appeared from their morning encounter. Her dress had been brushed clean and pressed, her braids replaited with small blue ribbons that matched her favorite color. In her arms, she carried a small cloth doll that looked like it had been crafted from various fabric scraps: brown calico for the face and hands, blue gingham for the dress, yellow yarn for the hair. The doll was clearly well loved, showing the wear that came from being a child's constant companion. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison," Ruby said formally, her voice carrying a tremor of nervousness. "Good afternoon, Miss Ruby." Samuel removed his hat, running his fingers through his hair as he tried to gather his composure. "I see you brought a friend." Ruby looked down at the doll in her arms, her cheeks flushing slightly. "This is Sarah. Named after my mama. Mrs. Whitman taught me to sew her when I first came here. She said everybody needs something to hold on to when the nights get too quiet." The simple explanation hit Samuel harder than he'd expected. The doll wasn't just a toy, it was Ruby's anchor, her connection to the mother she'd lost, a tangible reminder that she was capable of both loving and being loved. The fact that she'd chosen to bring Sarah to this gathering spoke to how important this moment was to her. "She's very well made," Samuel said, meaning it. The stitching was neat, despite being done by a child's hands, and the care taken in selecting. The fabric showed an artistic eye. "Your mother would be proud of your needlework." Ruby's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains. "You really think so?" "I do." Samuel found himself meaning the words more than he'd expected. "Now, before we go in, we should discuss how we're going to handle this. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" Ruby shifted the doll to one arm and smoothed down her dress with her free hand. "I've been thinking about that, sir. When the families come to meet us, we all stand in the front parlor, and Mrs. Whitman introduces us one by one. Usually, she talks about how long we've been here and what we're good at. Then, families can come talk to any children they might be interested in." Samuel nodded, though the process sounded uncomfortably clinical to him. "And you want me to stand with you during this introduction?" "Yes, sir, if you would. And maybe—" She hesitated, then seemed to steel herself. "Maybe you could say something nice about me, like a real papa would." The request was so innocent, so hopeful, that Samuel felt his throat tighten. When was the last time anyone had asked him to speak well of them? When was the last time he'd had the opportunity to advocate for someone who couldn't advocate for themselves? "What would you like me to say?" Ruby bit her lower lip, thinking carefully. "Maybe that I'm a good reader. and that I help with cooking and mending, and that I—" She stopped, her voice becoming smaller. "That I know how to love somebody, even if they ain't my blood family." The vulnerability in her voice nearly undid Samuel's composure entirely. This child, who'd lost everything, was still brave enough to offer her heart to strangers. The contrast between her openness and his own emotional walls couldn't have been starker. "Ruby," he said gently, "anyone who can't see those qualities in you doesn't deserve to be your family." "But they got to see them first," she replied, with the pragmatism of a child who'd learned hard lessons early. "That's why I need somebody standing with me, just so they'll look." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching wagons and horses drew their attention. 3 families were arriving simultaneously: the Hendersons from the neighboring valley, the Crawfords from town, and the Millers from the eastern settlements. Samuel recognized them all, respectable folks who'd likely treat any child they adopted with kindness and care. As he watched the families climb down from their conveyances, Samuel was reminded of his own childhood, of the social gatherings where he'd stood beside his father while Thomas surveyed potential business partners and social connections. The difference, of course, was that Thomas had been evaluating people for their usefulness to him, while these families were looking for children to love and raise. Still, the memory stirred uncomfortable feelings. Samuel had spent so many years trying to distance himself from his father's world that he'd forgotten how to navigate social situations that required him to represent someone else's interests. What if he said the wrong thing? What if his presence actually hurt Ruby's chances, rather than helping them? "Mr. Harrison," Ruby's voice was barely above a whisper, "you look worried. Are you having second thoughts?" Samuel looked down at her upturned face, seeing his own anxiety reflected in her expression. She was trying to be brave, but he could see the fear lurking beneath her hopeful exterior. The fear that he might abandon her just when she needed him most. "No second thoughts," he said, surprised to find he meant it. "Just trying to figure out the best way to help you." Ruby's grip on her doll tightened. "You don't have to do nothing fancy, sir. Just stand there and maybe put your hand on my shoulder when Mrs. Whitman introduces me, like you're proud to claim me." The phrase, "proud to claim me," hit Samuel like a physical blow. When was the last time his own father had been proud to claim him? Thomas Harrison had spent more time criticizing Samuel's soft heart and lack of business acumen than acknowledging any positive qualities. The irony wasn't lost on Samuel that this child was asking him to provide the very thing he'd spent his own childhood craving. Mrs. Whitman appeared in the doorway, her kind face beaming as she spotted Samuel and Ruby together. "Mr. Harrison, what a pleasant surprise. Ruby mentioned you might be joining us today." Samuel found himself responding before he'd fully processed the implications of her words. "Yes, ma'am. Ruby asked me to accompany her this afternoon." Mrs. Whitman's eyes sparkled with understanding and approval. "How wonderful. It's always nice when the children have someone special supporting them." As more families arrived and the afternoon's activities began in earnest, Samuel realized there was no turning back. He'd committed himself to this charade, and Ruby was counting on him to see it through. Looking at her clutching her homemade doll, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch his arm, as if to reassure herself that he was really there, Samuel understood that the next few hours would test not just his acting abilities, but his capacity for the kind of courage Ruby displayed every day. The courage to hope, to trust, and to open one's heart to the possibility of love, even in the face of repeated disappointment. The orphanage parlor had been transformed for the afternoon's gathering. Mrs. Whitman had arranged the furniture to create an open space where the 12 children could be presented to the assembled families. Fresh wildflowers adorned the mantelpiece, and someone had polished the wooden floors until they gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Despite the cheerful atmosphere, Samuel could feel the tension underlying the event, the weight of life-changing decisions that would be made before the day was through. As families settled into chairs arranged in a semicircle, Samuel positioned himself slightly behind Ruby, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as she'd requested. She stood straighter under his touch, and he could feel some of the tension leave her small frame. In his coat pocket, his mother's worn Bible pressed against his ribs, a reminder of faith he'd carried but rarely consulted since leaving Virginia. The leather binding had softened with age and handling, though Samuel couldn't remember the last time he'd opened it, seeking comfort or guidance. Mrs. Whitman clapped her hands softly to gather everyone's attention. "Welcome, friends and neighbors, to our special gathering. As you know, we have 12 wonderful children who are hoping to find their forever families today. Each of these young ones has their own story, their own gifts, and their own dreams for the future." Samuel surveyed the other children lined up beside Ruby, noting their various expressions of hope, nervousness, and carefully practiced composure. There was Timothy, barely 6 years old, who kept tugging at his too large shirt and glancing anxiously at the assembled adults. Maria, 8, stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her dark eyes serious and watchful. The Patterson twins, Johnny and James, held hands tightly, their matching freckled faces wearing identical expressions of determination not to be separated. Each child represented a story of loss, Samuel realized. Parents claimed by disease, accident, or the harsh realities of frontier life. Yet they also represented hope, the possibility that endings could become new beginnings, that families could be built by choice rather than just blood. "Let me introduce you to Ruby Washington," Mrs. Whitman continued, turning toward Ruby with a warm smile. "Ruby is 10 years old and has been with us for 3 years. She's one of our finest students, reads at a level well beyond her years, and has a gift for helping the younger children feel at home." Samuel felt Ruby's slight tremor under his hand and gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. This was his moment. To fulfill his promise, to speak the words that might help someone see her worth. "If I may," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "I've had the pleasure of getting to know Ruby today, and I can tell you that any family would be blessed to have her. She's intelligent, compassionate, and has the kind of courage that comes from facing hardship with grace." He paused, surprised by how easily the words came, how much he meant them despite having known her for only a few hours. "She reminds me that the best families are built not just on blood, but on the choice to love and support each other through whatever life brings." Ruby looked up at him with such gratitude and surprise that Samuel felt something shift inside his chest. The Bible in his pocket seemed to grow warmer, as if responding to this moment of unexpected truth-telling. Mrs. Whitman beamed at both of them. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. It's wonderful when our children have such strong advocates." She moved on to introduce Timothy, but Samuel barely heard the words. He was too focused on Ruby's reaction to his impromptu speech. "You really meant that?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes," Samuel replied, realizing he absolutely did mean it. Every word. As the introductions continued, Samuel found himself observing the dynamics between families and children. With new eyes, he watched as the Hendersons immediately gravitated toward Timothy, drawn perhaps by his youth, and the way his nervousness made him appear particularly vulnerable and in need of protection. The Crawfords spent several minutes talking with Maria, their questions revealing genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings, rather than just her practical abilities. But it was the Millers who captured Samuel's particular attention. They were a middle-aged couple whose own children had grown and left home, and they moved through the room with the patience and wisdom that came from having raised children before. They spoke with several of the older children, those who might be overlooked by families seeking younger adoptees, and Samuel could see them listening carefully to each child's answers, treating them as individuals rather than interchangeable recipients of their charity. "Mr. Harrison," Ruby whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve, "the Millers are coming over." Indeed, Thomas and Margaret Miller were approaching, their faces kind but appraising. Thomas was a tall, thin man with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. Margaret was shorter and rounder, with gentle eyes and the sort of smile that suggested she'd comforted many tears and celebrated many small victories. "Good afternoon," Thomas said, extending his hand to Samuel. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Thomas Miller, and this is my wife, Margaret." "Samuel Harrison," Samuel replied, shaking the man's hand and noting the firm, honest grip. "And this is Ruby Washington." Margaret Miller knelt down to Ruby's eye level, a gesture that immediately set Samuel's mind at ease. "Hello, Ruby. What a lovely doll you have there." Ruby hugged Sarah closer to her chest. "Thank you, Mom. I made her myself. Mrs. Whitman taught me how to sew. The stitching is very neat," Margaret observed. "Do you enjoy needlework?" "Yes, ma'am. I also like reading and helping with the younger children. I can cook some too. Mrs. Whitman taught me to make biscuits that don't turn out like rocks." The Millers laughed at this, and Samuel felt some of his own tension ease. These seemed like good people, the kind who might genuinely appreciate Ruby's qualities, rather than seeing her differences as obstacles. "Mr. Harrison," Thomas said quietly, "Ruby is fortunate to have such a devoted father. It's clear you think very highly of her." Samuel felt the Bible shift in his pocket, as if reminding him of the weight of truth and deception. For a moment, he considered correcting Thomas's assumption, explaining the temporary nature of his relationship with Ruby, but looking down at her hopeful face, seeing how the Miller's attention was making her stand taller and smile brighter, he found himself unable to destroy this moment for her. "She's a remarkable young lady," Samuel said instead, which was nothing but the truth. Margaret Miller rose to her feet, studying both Samuel and Ruby with thoughtful eyes. "Ruby, what would you say is the most important thing about being part of a family?" Ruby considered the question seriously, her brow furrowing with concentration. "I think it's choosing to stay, even when things get hard. My mama used to say that love ain't just a feeling, it's a decision you make every day." Samuel felt his throat tighten at her words. The wisdom in her answer spoke to experiences no 10-year-old should have to possess, yet it also revealed the depth of character that had allowed her to survive and thrive, despite her losses. The Millers exchanged a meaningful look, and Samuel realized they were seeing what he was beginning to see, that Ruby wasn't just another orphan hoping for a home, but a young woman with the strength and insight to enrich whatever family was wise enough to choose her. As the afternoon progressed, Samuel found himself drawn deeper into the emotional undercurrents of the adoption process than he'd ever intended. The careful choreography of families moving between children, the quiet conversations filled with hope and assessment, the way some children's faces brightened with possibility while others struggled to mask their disappointment. It was a delicate dance of hearts seeking connection, and Samuel was discovering he couldn't remain as detached as he'd planned. The Hendersons had indeed chosen Timothy, the 6-year-old whose nervous energy had transformed into excited chatter once he realized he was wanted. Samuel watched as Mrs. Henderson knelt down to help Timothy gather his few possessions, her gentle manner promising the security the boy had been seeking. The sight should have warmed Samuel's heart, but instead it triggered an unexpected flash of memory. In his vest pocket, alongside his father's watch and his mother's Bible, Samuel carried something else, a small daguerreotype photograph so faded with age that the faces were barely visible. It was a picture of himself at age 8, standing beside his younger sister, Elizabeth. She died of scarlet fever when she was only 5, and the loss had shattered something fundamental in their family's foundation. Samuel remembered standing in the plantation's front parlor after Elizabeth's funeral, watching his father's business. Associates offer their condolences. Thomas Harrison had received their sympathies with stoic dignity, but Samuel had seen the way his father's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. Elizabeth had been Thomas's favorite, the daughter who could make him laugh when nothing else could, and her death had hardened him in ways that affected everyone around him. The parallel wasn't lost on Samuel as he watched Ruby anxiously observe. the other children's interactions with prospective families. Like Elizabeth, Ruby possessed a light that drew people toward her, a capacity for joy that seemed to transcend her circumstances. Unlike his sister, though, Ruby had survived the hardships that life had thrown at her, emerging stronger rather than being taken away. "The Patterson twins are being separated," Ruby whispered, her voice tight with distress. Samuel followed her gaze to see Johnny and James standing on opposite sides of the room, each talking with different families. The boys kept glancing at each other with expressions of barely contained panic, their earlier determination to stay together crumbling in the face of practical realities. "Sometimes families can only take one child," Samuel said quietly, though. The explanation felt inadequate even to him. "That ain't right," Ruby said fiercely. "They're brothers. They've been taking care of each other since their mama died. You don't split up family just because it's convenient." Her passion surprised Samuel. He'd expected her to be focused entirely on her own situation, but instead she was genuinely distressed by the plight of others. It was another glimpse into the character that lay beneath her hopeful exterior, a fierce loyalty and sense of justice that reminded him uncomfortably of his own younger self, before life had taught him to protect his heart by keeping others at a distance. The Crawfords had taken Maria aside for what appeared to be a serious conversation. The 8-year-old was answering their questions with the careful composure of someone who understood this might be her only chance. Samuel could see the tension in her small shoulders, the way she was trying to be everything they might want, while still being true to herself. "What happens to the ones who don't get chosen today?" Samuel asked Ruby, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "They stay until they're old enough to work for their keep," Ruby replied matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Whitman tries to find them positions as hired help or apprentices. Some of the girls become seamstresses or work in the hotel. The boys might get work at the livery stable or with one of the ranchers." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. The fate she was describing with such calm acceptance was likely her own if today didn't go well. At 10, Ruby was approaching the age where she'd transitioned from being a potential daughter to being a potential employee. Still cared for, perhaps, but no longer eligible for the kind of family bonds she so clearly craved. The Miller couple approached again, this time with more focused intent. Margaret's eyes were kind but serious as she addressed Ruby directly. "Ruby, dear, we'd like to know more about your dreams for the future. If you could have anything you wanted, what would that look like?" Ruby glanced up at Samuel, seeking some form of permission or encouragement. The trust in her eyes made his chest tighten. When he nodded, she turned back to the Millers with renewed confidence. "I'd like to learn to be a teacher, ma'am. I want to help children learn to read like Mrs. Whitman taught me. And I'd like to have a family that chooses to stay together, even when things get difficult." She paused, then added quietly, "I'd like to belong somewhere permanent." Margaret Miller's eyes grew soft with understanding. "Those are beautiful dreams, Ruby. What would you say to a family who wanted to help you achieve them?" Samuel felt Ruby's excitement like electricity in the air, but he also sensed her fear of hoping too much. She'd been disappointed before, and the careful way she was containing her enthusiasm spoke to hard-won wisdom about protecting her heart. "I'd say I'd work as hard as I could to make them proud to have chosen me," Ruby answered. "And I'd love them with everything I have, because I know what it feels like not to have anybody, and I wouldn't want to waste the gift of family by taking it for granted." The photograph in Samuel's pocket seemed to burn against his chest. Elizabeth had loved with that same wholehearted intensity, that same appreciation for the preciousness of family bonds. The difference was that Elizabeth had been born into love, while Ruby had learned to treasure it through its absence. Thomas Miller extended his hand to Samuel. "Mr. Harrison, might we speak privately for a moment?" Samuel's heart began to race. This was the moment he'd been dreading, when his deception would be tested, when he'd have to maintain the pretense that Ruby was his daughter, while knowing that her entire future might hang in the balance. "Of course," Samuel replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. As they stepped away from Ruby, who remained standing bravely beside Mrs. Whitman, Samuel realized that somewhere in the past few hours, his feelings about this arrangement had changed completely. What had started as a reluctant favor to help a desperate child had become something much more personal. The thought of Ruby aging out of the orphanage system, of her dreams of teaching and belonging being reduced to the harsh realities of domestic service, filled him with a protective fury he hadn't felt since Elizabeth's death. The faded photograph pressed against his heart seemed to whisper a truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge, that some connections transcend blood and circumstance, that family can be forged in moments of choice and compassion, and that the capacity for love doesn't diminish with loss, but rather deepens, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. Thomas Miller's private conversation proved to be both more and less challenging than Samuel had anticipated. The older man's questions were gentle but probing, focusing not on the logistics of Samuel's relationship with Ruby, but on his commitment to her future and well-being. Samuel found himself answering with surprising honesty about Ruby's character and potential, though he carefully avoided specifics that might reveal the temporary nature of their arrangement. When they returned to Ruby's side, Samuel could see the barely contained hope in her eyes, the way her small hands trembled slightly as she clutched her doll. The Millers spoke quietly with Mrs. Whitman, their conversation too low for Ruby to hear, but their serious expressions suggested important decisions were being weighed. "Mr. Harrison," Ruby whispered as they waited, "what happens after the 10 minutes are up?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. In all his focus on helping her through this immediate moment, he'd avoided thinking about the aftermath. What would happen when families made their decisions and he returned to his ranch, leaving Ruby to face whatever outcome awaited her? The thought of simply walking away from her now seemed unconscionable, yet he'd made no plans beyond their agreed-upon charade. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, the honest answer feeling both inadequate and necessary. Ruby nodded as if she'd expected as much, but Samuel caught the flicker of disappointment that crossed her features. She'd been hoping, he realized, that their connection might extend beyond the practical arrangement they'd made. The realization that she might have genuine feelings for him, not just gratitude for his help, but actual affection, created a weight in his chest he wasn't prepared to carry. "Can I tell you something, Mr. Harrison?" Ruby asked, her voice barely audible above the conversations happening around them. "Of course." Ruby looked around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard, then reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a thin metal ring, tarnished with age and worn smooth from handling. She held it carefully in her palm, as if it were made of the most precious metal. "This was my mama's wedding ring," she said softly. "It ain't worth much. Just brass, I think, but it's the only thing I got left of her. Mrs. Whitman said I could keep it as long as I was careful with it." Samuel studied the simple band, struck by how much meaning could be contained in such a modest object. The ring represented Ruby's entire connection to her past, her proof that she'd once been part of a family that loved her. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Samuel said. "She was," Ruby replied, carefully tucking the ring back into her pocket. "She used to tell me stories about her mama, my grandmother, who was born into slavery but lived to see freedom. Mama said our family was strong because we knew how to love each other through hard times, how to choose hope even when everything looked hopeless." The weight of generations seemed to rest in Ruby's small frame, the legacy of women who'd survived unimaginable hardships through the strength of their connections to each other. Samuel thought of his own family legacy: wealth built on the suffering of others, relationships poisoned by pride and prejudice, love withheld as punishment for perceived weakness. "What would your mother think of you asking me to stand with you today?" Samuel asked. Ruby considered the question seriously. "I think she'd understand. She always said that family ain't just about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them most." She looked up at Samuel with eyes that seemed far too wise for her age. "You showed up, Mr. Harrison. Even though you don't know me, even though you got nothing to gain from it, you showed up when I asked for help." Samuel felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his heart, the emotional distance that had protected him for so many years, seemed suddenly fragile in the face of this child's simple gratitude and trust. "Ruby," he said carefully, "what if the 10 minutes we agreed on turned into something longer? What if—" He stopped, unsure how to finish the thought, unsure what he was even suggesting. Before Ruby could respond, Mrs. Whitman approached with the Millers in tow. The elderly woman's expression was kind but serious, and Samuel felt Ruby tense beside him. "Ruby, dear," Mrs. Whitman said gently, "the Millers would like to speak with you and Mr. Harrison together." Margaret Miller knelt down once again to Ruby's eye level. "Ruby, my husband and I have been very impressed with you today. You're clearly an intelligent, caring young lady with a bright future ahead of her." Samuel felt Ruby's hope rising like heat from a fire, but he also sensed her fear of disappointment. She'd been through this process before, had her hopes raised only to be let down when families ultimately chose younger or different children. "However," Margaret continued, and Samuel felt Ruby deflate slightly at the word, "we want to make sure any decision we make is in your best interests as well as ours. We've never adopted a child who already had a father figure in her life, and we want to understand how that might work." Thomas Miller addressed Samuel directly. "Mr. Harrison, Margaret and I have been married for 32 years. We raised 4 children of our own, and now we find ourselves with an empty house and hearts still full of love to give. Ruby, clearly, adores you, and we wouldn't want to disrupt a relationship that's obviously meaningful to both of you." Samuel felt trapped between truth and deception, between Ruby's desperate need for a family and his own growing attachment to her. The lies he'd agreed to tell for her benefit were now threatening to complicate what might be her best chance at finding a real home. "Ruby's happiness is the most important thing," Samuel said carefully. "She deserves a family who will love her unconditionally and support her dreams." "But what about you?" Margaret asked gently. "How do you see your role in Ruby's life going forward?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore and impossible to answer simply. Samuel looked down at Ruby, seeing the trust and hope and growing affection in her eyes, and realized that his answer would determine not just her immediate future, but his own as well. The 10 minutes they'd agreed upon had long since passed, but neither of them had mentioned it. Somewhere in the space between pretense and reality, something genuine had taken root, something that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. Samuel touched the faded photograph in his pocket, thinking of his sister Elizabeth and the love that had been lost, then looked at Ruby and wondered if he had the courage to risk loving again. The weight of Margaret Miller's question hung heavy in the orphanage parlor as Samuel struggled to find words that would honor both truth and Ruby's needs. Before he could formulate an answer, Mrs. Whitman interrupted with an expression of sudden recognition that would change everything. "Ruby." "Washington," she said slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Washington. I just realized. Ruby, didn't you tell me once that your father's full name was Benjamin Washington Harrison?" Ruby nodded, confused by the sudden shift in conversation. "Yes, ma'am. Papa always said the Harrison part came from his mama's side, back when slaves sometimes took their masters' names." Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. The pocket watch in his vest seemed to grow heavier, its steady ticking suddenly deafening in his ears. "What did you say his full name was?" "Benjamin Washington Harrison," Ruby repeated, looking between Samuel and Mrs. Whitman with growing bewilderment. "Why? What's wrong?" Samuel's hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out not his father's watch or his mother's Bible, but a different document entirely. One he'd carried for years without fully understanding its significance. It was a legal paper, yellowed with age and folded so many times the creases had worn thin. He'd received it from his father's lawyer after Thomas Harrison's death 2 years ago, along with the notification that he'd inherited the entirety of the Virginia plantation. The document was a manumission record, a formal certificate of freedom, issued to a slave named Mary Harrison in 1825, just 3 years before Samuel had left Virginia. But it wasn't just any manumission record. At the bottom, in his father's distinctive handwriting, was a note. Mary Harrison, daughter of the household, freed upon reaching her 18th year. Any children born to her shall bear the Harrison name and be considered family, regardless of their station. Samuel had never understood what the document meant. Mary had been the young woman he'd befriended as a child, the one whose death had broken his heart and contributed to his final break with his father. But he'd never known she'd had children, never suspected that his father's note about her offspring bearing the Harrison name was anything more than legal formality. "Ruby," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion, "what year was your father born?" 1825, I think. He would have been 22 when I was born. Ruby's confusion was giving way to concern as she saw the strangeness in Samuel's behavior. "Mr. Harrison, you're scaring me. What's happening?" Samuel's mind raced as he did the mathematics. If Benjamin had been born in 1825, the same year Mary had been freed, and if Thomas Harrison's note about Mary's children was to be believed, then Ruby wasn't just any orphan seeking help from a stranger. She was his family, his sister's daughter. His niece, connected to him by blood he'd never known, flowed through her veins. The irony was staggering. Ruby had approached him asking him to pretend to be her father for 10 minutes, never knowing that he was, in fact, already family. Samuel had agreed to help her out of pity and old guilt, never suspecting that the connection between them ran deeper than temporary compassion. "Mrs. Whitman," Samuel said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady, "do you have any records about Ruby's grandparents, specifically her father's mother?" Mrs. Whitman's eyes widened with understanding. "Ruby, dear, didn't your father tell you stories about his mother? What was her name?" "Mary," Ruby said quietly. "He called her Mary Harrison. He said she died when he was young, but that she was the kindest person who ever lived. He said she used to work in a big house in Virginia, and that the family there was good to her." She paused, her voice growing smaller. "He said she was freed when she turned 18, and that the man who freed her told her any children she had would always have a place in the world." Samuel felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The Mary that Ruby's father had described was the same Mary who'd been his childhood friend, his father's daughter. The realization hit him like lightning. Mary hadn't been just a slave in the Harrison household. She'd been Thomas Harrison's illegitimate daughter, Samuel's half-sister, and Thomas had acknowledged her in the only way his society would have allowed, by freeing her and ensuring her children would carry the family name. The manumission document shook in Samuel's hands as the full implications sank in. Ruby wasn't just asking him to pretend to be her father. She was unknowingly asking her great-uncle to acknowledge the family connection that already existed between them. "Ruby," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible." The Millers and Mrs. Whitman had grown quiet, sensing the gravity of whatever revelation was unfolding. Ruby looked up at Samuel with wide, trusting eyes, still clutching her doll, and unaware that her entire understanding of her place in the world was about to change. Samuel knelt down to Ruby's eye level, just as the Millers had done, but his motivation was entirely different now. He was looking into the face of family, trying to see traces of Mary, of his father, of the bloodline that connected them across years of separation and ignorance. "The woman your father called Mary Harrison, his mother, she was my sister," Samuel said slowly. "My half-sister, actually, which means your father was my nephew, and you—" He swallowed hard, struggling with the magnitude of what he was saying. "You're my great-niece, Ruby. We're family. We've been family all along." Ruby stared at him in stunned silence, her small face cycling through disbelief, hope, and confusion. The doll slipped from her grasp, landing softly on the polished floor, as her hands flew to her mouth. "But that can't be true," she whispered. "If we was family, somebody would have told me. Somebody would have come for me when Mama and Papa died." Samuel felt the weight of 3 years of unnecessary loss, 3 years during which Ruby had been alone in the world, while he lived less than a day's ride away, never knowing she existed. The guilt was crushing, but beneath it was something else, a fierce protectiveness, a sense of rightness that explained the immediate connection he'd felt to her. "I didn't know," Samuel said, his voice thick with regret. "I never knew Mary had. Children never knew your father existed. If I had known, Ruby, I would have come for you the moment I learned of your parents' deaths. You never would have spent a single night wondering if you belonged somewhere." Mrs. Whitman had tears in her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. "Ruby, dear, this means you do have family after all. You have someone who wants to claim you, not just for 10 minutes, but forever." Margaret Miller reached for her husband's hand, both of them clearly moved by the unexpected turn of events. "This changes everything," she said softly. Samuel looked up at them, suddenly understanding that Ruby's situation was no longer about adoption by strangers. The Millers were good people who would have loved and cared for her, but they couldn't offer what Samuel could, the connection to her history, her heritage, the family legacy that was rightfully hers. "It does change everything," Samuel agreed, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Ruby doesn't need to be adopted by anyone. She's a Harrison. She belongs on the Harrison Ranch, with the Harrison name and all the rights that come with it." Ruby's eyes filled with tears as the full meaning of his words sank in. "You mean it? You really mean it? I don't have to pretend anymore. I really do belong somewhere." Samuel pulled her into his arms, feeling the rightness of it settle deep in his bones. "You've always belonged somewhere, Ruby. We just didn't know where until now." The 10-minute charade had become a lifetime commitment, and Samuel discovered that he'd never made a decision that felt more natural or more necessary. The walls around his heart hadn't just cracked. They'd crumbled entirely, making room for the family love he'd thought lost forever. The hours that followed the revelation passed in a blur of overwhelming emotion and practical necessities that Samuel had never imagined he'd face. Word of Ruby's true identity spread through the orphanage, gathering like wildfire, transforming what had begun as a routine adoption event into something unprecedented. The discovery of a lost family member, the reunion of blood that had been separated by death and ignorance. Mrs. Whitman had immediately ushered Samuel and Ruby into her private office, away from the curious eyes and whispered conversations of the other families. The small room, lined with books and children's drawings, became a sanctuary where they could process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. "I need to understand everything," Samuel said, his hands still trembling as he smoothed out the manumission document on Mrs. Whitman's desk. "Ruby, tell me everything your father told you about his mother, about Mary." Ruby sat in a large chair that made her appear even smaller than usual, her legs dangling several inches from the floor. Despite the overwhelming nature of the afternoon's discoveries, there was a new light in her eyes, the first genuine hope Samuel had seen since their morning encounter. "Papa said his mama was the smartest person he ever knew," Ruby began, her voice growing stronger as she shared the stories that had been her connection to a grandmother she'd never met. "He said she could read and write better than most white folks, that she learned by listening at doors and watching lessons that weren't meant for her." Samuel nodded, remembering Mary's quick mind and eager questions. His father had allowed her to sit in on lessons with Samuel and Elizabeth, though he'd never acknowledged that decision as anything more than practical, an extra child to keep his legitimate children company. Papa said she worked in the big house, taking care of a family that treated her different from the other slaves. He said she told him once that the master's son, that would be you, I guess, was the kindest boy she ever knew, that he used to... share his books with her, and treated her like a real sister. The memory hit Samuel like a physical blow. He could see Mary clearly now in his mind's eye, not as the tragic figure she'd become in his memory, but as the vibrant young woman she'd been before illness took her. She'd been barely 18 when she died, just old enough to taste freedom, just young enough to still believe in the possibility of a better world. "What happened to her after she was freed?" Samuel asked. "Papa said she went to work for a freed family in Richmond, taking care of their children while she learned to read and write even better. That's where she met Papa's father, a blacksmith named Joseph Washington, who'd bought his own freedom." Ruby's voice grew softer. "Papa said his mama always told him that freedom wasn't just about not being owned by somebody else. It was about having the right to choose your own family, your own life, your own future." Samuel felt the weight of his father's signet ring through his vest pocket, the heavy gold band that bore the Harrison family crest, passed down through generations of men who'd built their legacy on the ownership of others. Thomas Harrison had given Mary her freedom, but he'd never acknowledged her publicly as his daughter. Even his private notation about her children bearing the Harrison name had been a secret kept until after his death. "Samuel," Mrs. Whitman said, gently, "I can see this is overwhelming, but we need to discuss the practical implications. If Ruby is truly your great-niece, her legal situation changes completely." Samuel looked up from the document, his mind struggling to process the legal and social ramifications of what they'd discovered. In Texas, the law was more flexible than in the old southern states, but taking custody of a black child, even one who was family, would still raise questions and challenges. "What are you thinking?" Mrs. Whitman asked. "I'm thinking that Ruby has been alone in the world for 3 years, when she should have been home with family," Samuel said, his voice growing firmer with each word. "I'm thinking that my father's sins don't have to become Ruby's burden. I'm thinking that it's time the Harrison name meant something better than it has in the past." Ruby slipped down from her chair and approached the desk where the manumission document lay spread out. "Can I see it?" she asked quietly. Samuel handed her the yellowed paper, watching as she traced the faded words with her finger. Her reading skills, cultivated by Mrs. Whitman's patient teaching, allowed her to understand the legal language that had shaped her family's fate decades before she was born. "It says here that Mary Harrison's children shall be considered family, regardless of their station," Ruby read aloud. What did he mean by that? Samuel exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Whitman. The phrase was Thomas Harrison's way of acknowledging that Mary's children might be born into circumstances that society wouldn't traditionally recognize as legitimate. Family, mixed-race children in a world that often denied such people their rightful place. "He meant that you belong," Samuel said simply. "Whatever else my father was, whatever mistakes he made sure that Mary's children and grandchildren would always have a claim to the Harrison name and everything that comes with it." The significance of this was not lost on Ruby. At 10 years old, she understood that names carried power, that family connections could mean the difference between a life of service and a life of possibility. The Harrison name, with all its complicated history, also carried wealth, land, and social standing that could transform her future entirely. "But what about the other children?" Ruby asked, glancing toward the door that led back to the parlor, where the adoption gathering was still taking place. "What about Timothy and Maria and the Patterson twins? They need families too." Samuel felt a surge of pride at her question. Even in the midst of her own miraculous discovery, Ruby's first thought was for the other orphans, who hadn't been blessed with found family. It was exactly the kind of compassion he would have expected from Mary's granddaughter. "They'll find their families," Mrs. Whitman assured her. "The Hendersons have already committed to Timothy, and I believe the Crawfords are very close to deciding on Maria. As for the Patterson twins, well, we'll keep working until we find a family that wants to keep them together." Samuel pulled his father's signet ring from his pocket, studying the family crest that had been carved into the heavy gold. It depicted a tree with deep roots and spreading branches, a symbol of family legacy and enduring strength. For too many years, that tree had grown in tainted soil, nourished by the suffering of others, but perhaps it was time for new growth, new branches that would bear fruit worthy of the Harrison name. "Ruby," he said, his voice growing solemn with the weight of what he was about to propose, "I want you to understand what this means. If you come home with me, if you take the Harrison name officially, your life will change in ways you can't imagine. You'll have opportunities that most children, black or white, never dream of. But you'll also carry the weight of a complicated family history, and there will be people who question your right to bear the Harrison name." Ruby met his gaze directly, her young face showing a maturity that spoke to the hardships she'd already endured. "Mr. Samuel, I've been carrying the weight of being nobody's child for 3 years. I think I can handle carrying the weight of being somebody's family." Her words cut straight to Samuel's heart. This child, who'd spent years believing herself to be utterly alone in the world, was ready to embrace not just the privileges of family, but also its responsibilities and burdens. She wasn't asking for a fairy tale rescue. She was asking for the chance to belong to something larger than herself, to contribute to a legacy rather than simply benefit from it. "There's something else," Samuel said, pulling out the faded daguerreotype of himself and Elizabeth. "I want you to see this." Ruby studied the photograph carefully, her eyes widening as she recognized Samuel's younger face. "Is that your sister, the one who died?" "Yes. Her name was Elizabeth, and she would have loved you." Samuel's voice grew thick with emotion. "She had the same kind heart you do, the same concern for others. I think maybe she would have wanted me to take care of you if she'd known you existed." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through Mrs. Whitman's office window, casting long shadows across the room as the adoption gathering continued in the parlor beyond. Samuel could hear the muffled voices of families making decisions that would shape children's lives, and he realized that he was about to make the most important decision of his own life. "Ruby Washington Harrison," he said formally, standing and extending his hand to her. "Would you do me the honor of coming home with me? Would you let me teach you what it means to be a Harrison, and would you teach me what it means to be family again?" Ruby took his hand without hesitation, her small fingers disappearing into his larger grip. "Yes, sir," she said solemnly. "I'd be proud to be your family, and I promise I'll try to make you proud to claim me." As they prepared to leave Mrs. Whitman's office and face the questions and reactions that awaited them, Samuel slipped his father's signet ring onto his finger for the first time in years. The weight of it felt different now, not like a burden of inherited guilt, but like a promise of redemption, a commitment to transform the Harrison legacy into something worthy of the remarkable young woman who would help carry it forward. When Samuel and Ruby emerged from Mrs. Whitman's office, the parlor had grown quiet in a way that spoke of barely contained curiosity and whispered speculation. The other families had clearly heard fragments of the extraordinary revelation that had unfolded behind the closed door, and their faces reflected a mixture of wonder, skepticism, and social calculation that Samuel recognized all too well from his childhood in Virginia. Mrs. Whitman had prepared a simple document, not formal adoption papers, since those wouldn't be necessary for a blood relative, but rather a guardianship transfer that would give Samuel legal authority over Ruby's care and future. The paper lay on a small writing desk, its official language stark and formal against the delicate lace doily beneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Whitman announced to the assembled crowd, "we have discovered something quite remarkable today. It appears that Ruby has been reunited with family she didn't know existed." Samuel felt the weight of every eye in the room, the careful assessment of people trying to understand how a wealthy white rancher had suddenly claimed kinship with a black orphan girl. He could practically hear the mental calculations being made, the social and racial mathematics that his community would use to judge both his decision and his character. Judge Cornelius Hayes, An elderly man who'd served on the territorial court for nearly 2 decades stepped forward with the authority that his position carried. "Mr. Harrison, this is quite an unusual situation. Perhaps you could explain to those of us present how you've determined this child to be your relation." The question was posed with judicial politeness, but Samuel heard the underlying skepticism. Hayes was a fair man by frontier standards, but he was also a product of his time and place, shaped by social conventions that didn't easily accommodate the kind of family connection Samuel was claiming. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling Ruby's small hand slip into his for support. The manumission document crinkled softly as he unfolded it, and he was acutely aware that his next words would determine not just Ruby's immediate future, but how their relationship would be perceived and accepted by the community they would both have to live in. "Judge Hayes, this document was issued by my father, Thomas Harrison, in 1825. Samuel's voice carried clearly across the hushed room. "It grants freedom to Mary Harrison, who was—" He paused, knowing that his next words would change how people saw both him and his family forever. "Who was my half-sister, my father's daughter by a woman enslaved on our Virginia plantation." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel could hear the tick of the mantel clock, the rustle of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, the sound of his own heart beating against his ribs. He'd just acknowledged publicly what polite society preferred to pretend didn't exist: the complicated family trees that grew in the shadow of slavery, the mixed-blood children who carried their fathers' names, but rarely their recognition. "Mary's son Benjamin was therefore my nephew," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Ruby is my great-niece, the last member of a family line I didn't know had survived. She belongs with me on the Harrison Ranch, bearing the Harrison name as her great-grandmother's manumission papers intended." Judge Hayes examined the document carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The legal language was clear and properly executed. Thomas Harrison's signature unmistakable. From a purely legal standpoint, Samuel's claim was unassailable. "The document appears to be in order," Hayes said finally, "but Mr. Harrison, you must understand the social implications of what you're proposing. Taking custody of a Negro child, even one who may be blood relation, will raise questions about your judgment and character." Samuel felt a flash of anger at the judge's words, but he also recognized the man's attempt at fairness. Hayes was simply stating the reality that Samuel would face: the whispered doubts, the social ostracism, the business relationships that might suffer because of his choice to publicly claim Ruby as family. "Judge Hayes," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface, "I've spent 15 years building a reputation based on fair dealing and honest work. If people choose to question my character because I'm willing to care for my own flesh and blood, then their opinions say more about them than they do about me." Ruby squeezed his hand tighter, her faith in him evident, even as she stood at the center of a debate about her very identity and worth. Samuel looked down at her upturned face and saw not just hope, but trust, absolute unwavering trust that he would stand by his words regardless of the social cost. The Millers, who had been prepared to offer Ruby a loving home just hours earlier, exchanged meaningful glances. Margaret Miller spoke first, her voice gentle but clear. "Mr. Harrison, we want you to know that if Ruby is your family, then we're truly happy for both of you. A child belongs with blood relatives who want them, and it's clear that you care deeply for her welfare." Thomas Miller nodded his agreement. "The paperwork seems straightforward enough. The question isn't legal, it's whether you're prepared for the challenges that come with your decision." Samuel understood what Miller was really asking. Was he prepared to face the prejudice that would inevitably arise? Was he ready to defend Ruby against those who would question her right to bear the Harrison name? Was he willing to sacrifice some of his own social standing to secure her future? The guardianship papers waited on the desk, requiring only his signature to make official what his heart had already decided. But as Samuel reached for the pen, he realized this moment represented more than just a legal formality. It was the complete dismantling of the emotional walls he'd spent years building, the final rejection of his father's legacy of separation and prejudice, and the beginning of a new chapter in the Harrison family story. Ruby looked up at him with eyes that held 15 years' worth of faith in the possibility of family, and Samuel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them gladly for the privilege of watching her grow up, knowing she was truly wanted and loved. Samuel's hand hovered over the guardianship papers for what felt like an eternity, though in reality it was only seconds. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, not because he doubted his choice, but because he understood fully what he was choosing. This wasn't just about taking in an orphaned child. This was about publicly declaring that love and family transcended the racial boundaries that society insisted on maintaining. "There's something else I need to make clear," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He reached into his coat and withdrew another document, the deed to his ranch, bearing the official seal of the Texas territorial government. "And when I sign these guardianship papers, I'm not just taking temporary custody of Ruby. I'm declaring her my legal heir, entitled to inherit the Harrison Ranch and everything that comes with it." A collective gasp rose from the assembled crowd. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, actually pressed her hand to her chest as if Samuel had announced something scandalous. The legal implications of what he was proposing were staggering. A black child inheriting one of the largest and most prosperous ranches in the territory. Judge Hayes leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Harrison, are you certain you've thought this through completely? You're talking about making significant changes to your will and estate planning based on a relationship you discovered only hours ago." Samuel looked down at Ruby, who was staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. She'd asked him to pretend to be her father for 10 minutes, and now he was offering to make her his daughter and heir in the eyes of both God and the law. "Ruby," he said gently, kneeling down so they were eye to eye, "I want you to understand what this means. If you come home with me, you won't just be living on the Harrison Ranch, you'll own part of it. Someday, when I'm gone, it will all be yours. You'll be one of the wealthiest landowners in Texas, with the education and resources to do whatever you want with your life." Ruby's lower lip trembled, and tears began to flow freely down her cheeks. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all that for me?" Samuel felt his own eyes fill with moisture as he answered. "Because you're family, Ruby. Because you're Mary's granddaughter and Benjamin's daughter, and they deserved better than what life gave them. Because you have the same brave heart that Mary had, the same determination to create something good out of difficult circumstances." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "And because, in the last few hours, you've reminded me what it feels like to have family again." The transformation in Ruby's expression was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. The careful composure she'd maintained throughout the adoption gathering crumbled, revealing the vulnerable child beneath who had been hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, would choose her. "Do you really mean it?" she asked through her tears. "You really want me to be your family forever?" "Forever," Samuel confirmed, reaching for the pen. As he signed his name to the guardianship papers with bold, decisive strokes, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Mrs. Henderson, who had been whispering urgently with her husband, suddenly stood up. "Mr. Harrison," she said clearly, "I want you to know that the Henderson family supports your decision completely. Ruby is a lovely child, and any man willing to claim his family regardless of society's prejudices is a man worth respecting." Her words seemed to break a dam of uncertainty. One by one, other voices rose in support. The Crawfords nodded their approval. Even some of the townspeople who had seemed most skeptical began to murmur agreement. "The girl clearly adores you," observed Dr. Mitchell, the town physician, "and anyone can see you care deeply for her welfare. That's what matters, not the color of her skin or the circumstances of her birth." Judge Hayes examined the signed papers and nodded solemnly. "The guardianship is legally binding as of this moment. Ruby Washington is now Ruby Washington Harrison, under the legal protection and care of Samuel Harrison." He looked at Ruby directly. "Young lady, you are no longer an orphan. You have a home and a family name to be proud of." Ruby threw her arms around Samuel's neck, burying her face against his shoulder as years of suppressed emotion finally found their release. Samuel held her tightly, feeling the rightness of it settle deep in his bones. The careful distance he'd maintained from human connection for so many years seemed not just unnecessary now, but cruel. How had he lived so long without knowing the profound satisfaction of being needed, of being trusted, of being loved unconditionally? "Thank you," Ruby whispered against his ear, her words meant for him alone. "Thank you for seeing me, for choosing me, for making me belong somewhere." Samuel pulled back just enough to look into her tear-streaked face. "Ruby, you don't need to thank me. I should be thanking you." "For what?" "For asking me to pretend to be your father for 10 minutes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It turned out to be the most honest thing I've done in 15 years. Mrs. Whitman approached with Ruby's few belongings. The worn leather shoes that had carried her through so many disappointments, the handmade doll that had been her comfort through lonely nights, and a small bundle of clothes that represented the entirety of her worldly possessions. "I believe these belong to you now, Miss Harrison," Mrs. Whitman said with a smile that reached her eyes. The sound of her new name, Miss Harrison, made Ruby's face light up with joy so pure it took Samuel's breath away. She was no longer Ruby Washington the orphan, hoping someone might choose her. She was Ruby Washington Harrison, heir to land and legacy, granddaughter of a woman who had fought for freedom, great niece of a man who had finally learned that love was stronger than the walls he'd built around his heart. As they prepared to leave the orphanage together, Samuel realized that the 10 minutes Ruby had asked for had stretched into a lifetime commitment, and he had never made a decision that felt more natural or more necessary. The Harrison family tree, which had grown twisted in the soil of slavery and prejudice, was finally ready to bear fruit worthy of its deep roots. 3 months had passed since that transformative Sunday afternoon at the Cedar Ridge orphanage, and the Harrison ranch had been filled with sounds it hadn't known in years. The rustle of a child's footsteps racing down the hallway, laughter echoing from the kitchen where Ruby helped prepare meals, and the gentle murmur of bedtime stories read aloud in the evening light. Samuel stood in the doorway of what had once been his father's study, watching Ruby carefully copy letters in her finest penmanship. She was working on correspondence with the Territorial Education Department, formally requesting advanced reading materials that would prepare her for the teaching career she still dreamed of pursuing. Her intelligence and determination had only become more apparent in the months since she'd come home, and Samuel had quietly arranged for her to receive tutoring that would rival anything available to wealthy white children in the East. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. There had been whispered conversations that stopped when Samuel entered the general store, business associates who seemed uncertain about his judgment, and a few social invitations that had mysteriously ceased to arrive. But there had also been unexpected support from quarters Samuel hadn't anticipated, and a grudging respect from many who admired his willingness to stand by his principles regardless of social pressure. "Uncle Samuel," Ruby called, looking up from her writing. "How do you spell curriculum?" The title still warmed Samuel's heart every time he heard it. They'd settled on Uncle Samuel as the most natural way for her to address him, honoring their actual relationship while acknowledging the parental role he'd taken in her life. The formality of Mr. Harrison had lasted exactly 1 day before they'd both agreed it felt wrong for family. CUR, "Ricculum," Samuel spelled out, moving to look over her shoulder at the neat lines of text. Her penmanship had improved dramatically, and her vocabulary had expanded to match her voracious reading appetite. "What are you writing about?" "I'm proposing a reading program for children who don't get to attend regular school," Ruby explained, her face bright with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Whitman says there are families out in the territory who want their children to learn but can't make it to town for lessons. I thought maybe we could organize traveling teachers, or at least get books to them somehow." Samuel smiled at the "we" in her statement. Ruby had seamlessly integrated not just into his household, but into his sense of purpose and community responsibility. Her natural compassion had found new outlets now that she felt secure in her own belonging, and her ideas often challenged Samuel to think beyond his own comfortable assumptions. The most significant change, however, had been commissioned just last week and now hung prominently in the front parlor, a family portrait painted by a traveling artist who specialized in frontier families. The painting showed Samuel and Ruby standing together on the ranch's front porch, with the rolling hills and cattle visible in the background. What made the portrait remarkable wasn't its technical quality, though the artist was skilled, but what it represented, public, permanent acknowledgement that they were family, meant to be seen and remembered together. Ruby had insisted on including her cloth doll Sarah in the portrait, and Samuel had worn his father's signet ring, both symbols now taking on new meaning. The doll represented not just Ruby's connection to her deceased parents, but her ability to love and be loved despite loss. The ring represented not the burden of inherited guilt, but the possibility of transforming a tainted legacy into something worthy of pride. "Uncle Samuel," Ruby said, setting down her pen and turning to face him fully, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked you to pretend to be my papa that day?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes. I think we both would have missed out on something precious. Mrs. Whitman says the Millers were real disappointed when they couldn't adopt me, but that they understand why I needed to be with family instead." "They're good people," Samuel agreed, "and they'll find the right child when the time comes." Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that, about how sometimes what looks like disappointment is really just life making room for something better to happen." The wisdom in her observation struck Samuel as profound. His own life had been shaped by disappointments, the loss of his sister, the break with his father, the years of emotional isolation that had followed. But without those disappointments, he might never have developed the empathy that allowed him to recognize Ruby's need or the courage to respond to it, regardless of social consequences. "Ruby," he said, settling into the chair beside her desk, "I want you to know that taking you in wasn't just about doing the right thing for you. It was about doing the right thing for me too. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to care for, someone to worry about, someone to be proud of." Ruby's eyes sparkled with affection and mischief. "So you're saying I saved you as much as you saved me?" "I'm saying we saved each other," Samuel replied, meaning it completely. The afternoon light was beginning to slant through the windows, casting the same golden glow that had illuminated their first meeting outside Murphy's General Store. But everything else had changed. The loneliness that had marked both their lives, the sense of not belonging anywhere, the fear that love was something other people experienced, but never them. Ruby returned to her letter writing, and Samuel to his ranch paperwork. But the comfortable silence between them was filled with the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly the people who matter most. As evening approached and the familiar rituals of supper and bedtime, stories beckoned, Samuel reflected on how a simple request for 10 minutes of pretense had become a lifetime of authentic love. Every child deserves to feel wanted, to stand beside someone who claims them as their own. But perhaps every adult deserves that too. The chance to be needed, to be trusted, to discover that the capacity for love doesn't diminish with time or loss, but simply waits for the right moment to bloom again. In the end, Ruby's desperate hope had been answered not by finding a new family, but by discovering the one that had always existed, waiting only for the courage to claim each other. And Samuel's long isolation had ended not through his own efforts, but through the simple act of saying yes to a child who believed that belonging was always possible, even when it required nothing more than standing together for 10 minutes that stretched into forever.